In the year 1520, a Portuguese horse trader named Domingo Paes rode into a city in southern India, and what he saw astonished him so completely that he sat down and wrote it all out, in careful, disbelieving detail. He described streets so wide that merchants could ride elephants down them side by side. He described a marketplace where jewelers sold rubies, pearls, and diamonds laid out in open baskets by the roadside, as casually as if they were selling vegetables. He estimated the city held as many people as Rome, one of the largest and richest cities he or almost anyone in the world at that time had ever seen. This was Vijayanagara, the city of victory, capital of the greatest Hindu empire of medieval South India, a metropolis so wealthy that visitors compared its splendor to nothing else on earth. And then, less than 50 years after Paes rode through those glittering streets, the city was gone. Not slowly abandoned, not worn down by time, burned, gutted, and left to the jungle in a matter of months, after a single catastrophic afternoon on a battlefield, never to be rebuilt again. Today, its ruins sprawl across more than 16 square miles of boulder-strewn countryside in the state of Karnataka, one of the largest archaeological sites on the planet, most of it still unexcavated, still half swallowed by the earth. How does a city that rich, that vast, simply die? To understand the answer, we have to go back to the desperate moment that gave this empire its birth. By the early 1300s, southern India was in crisis. For generations, the great Hindu kingdoms of the Deccan Plateau, the Hoysalas, the Kakatiyas, the last heirs of older southern dynasties, had ruled their own separate, prosperous domains. But now, armies from the Delhi Sultanate far to the north, and later, a series of independent Muslim sultanates carved out of the Deccan itself, were pushing relentlessly southward, sacking capitals, toppling old royal houses, and threatening to sweep away the entire political and religious order of the South. Out of that chaos, in 1336, two brothers, Harihara and Buka, founded a new city on the southern bank of the Tungabhadra River, in a landscape of dramatic granite hills and boulders that seemed almost sculpted by giant hands. According to tradition, the brothers were guided and encouraged in this founding by a revered sage named Vijayanagara, and they built their new capital as a fortress of resistance, a rallying point meant to hold the line against the sultanates pressing in from the north. They called it Vijayanagara, the city of victory. It was meant from its very first stone to be a survivor. And survive it did, growing over the following decades from a defensive stronghold into one of the great powers of the Indian subcontinent. Successive dynasties ruled from its throne, expanding its borders through the 15th century, until Vijayanagara controlled almost the entire southern tip of India, from coast to coast, collecting tribute from a mosaic of subordinate chiefs and absorbing the wealth of the region's ancient temple-based economy. But it was under one extraordinary ruler, in the early 1500s, that the empire reached a height of power and splendor that would echo through history and legend alike. His name was Krishnadeva Raya, and he came to the throne in 1509. He was, by every account that survives him, a warrior king of formidable energy, leading his armies personally on campaign after campaign, defeating rival sultanates to the north and rival kingdoms to the east, and expanding Vijayanagara's territory to its greatest extent. But Krishnadeva Raya was far more than a soldier. He was a passionate patron of literature, fluent in multiple languages, and he gathered around his court 8 legendary poets, still remembered today as the Ashtadigajas, the 8 elephants of the directions, a phrase meant to capture how they held up the very corners of the literary world. He himself composed poetry and a treatise on statecraft. Under his rule, temples across the empire received lavish new gateway towers and shrines. Irrigation tanks were dug to water the dry granite countryside. And the capital itself swelled into one of the great cities of the world. Try for a moment to walk those streets as Domingo Páez once did. Broad avenues lined with stone colonnades, roofed bazaars where the finest silks and cottons of India changed hands, and beyond them, a market built specifically for gems, where a foreign visitor with enough gold could, quite literally, buy a handful of diamonds off an open stall. Elephants moved through the crowds. Royal processions, marking festivals that stretched on for days, filled the wide streets with music, dancers, and thousands upon thousands of onlookers. Beyond the commercial quarters rose an enormous royal enclosure, a walled city within the city, holding audience halls, treasuries, and the king's own quarters, along with an artificial lake and pleasure gardens. Nearby stood the sacred core of Vijayanagara, a dense cluster of soaring temple complexes, their gateway towers, called gopurams, rising high enough to be seen for miles across the flat river plain. Among these temples stood one that has become, more than any other single structure, the emblem of Vijayanagara's genius, the Vitala Temple, dedicated to a form of the god Vishnu. Inside its main hall stand rows of slender stone pillars, carved by craftsmen with a skill bordering on the impossible, so precisely shaped and so perfectly proportioned that when struck, each one produces a distinct musical note, echoing the sound of different instruments, a stone orchestra frozen in a temple hall. Just outside, in the temple's courtyard, sits perhaps the single most photographed object in all of South Indian architecture, an enormous stone chariot, carved from solid granite so skillfully that its wheels appear at a glance capable of turning, complete with tiny carved axles and spokes rendered in perfect, dizzying detail. These were not simply religious monuments. They were declarations, carved permanently into the hardest stone the land could offer, of just how much wealth and skill this empire commanded. And that wealth flowed from an economy of astonishing reach. Vijayanagara sat at the crossroads of trade routes, stretching from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, and its merchants dealt in the treasures of half the known world. Fine cotton cloth and spices moved outward from its ports. War horses, essential to any medieval Indian army, and unable to be bred effectively in the tropical south, were imported by the thousands from Arabia and Persia through coastal harbors under royal contract, an arrangement so vital that controlling the horse trade was itself a matter of empire-level strategy. Foreign travelers, Portuguese, Persian, and Italian among them, left behind detailed accounts, marveling at the city's order, its wealth, and the sheer scale of its markets, accounts that, remarkably, still survive today as some of our richest windows into the empire's daily life. Beneath all of that glittering wealth ran something quieter but equally impressive: water. The dry granite plateau around Vijayanagara received relatively little rainfall, and yet the empire's engineers built an extraordinarily sophisticated system of dams, canals, and reservoirs to channel the waters of the Tungabhadra River across the landscape, irrigating fields and filling the city's tanks with drinking water even in the driest months. Some of these ancient canals are still in use by farmers in the region today, a working, functioning legacy of hydraulic engineering that has outlasted the empire that built it by nearly 500 years. For roughly 2 centuries, This was Vijayanagara, a bulwark of Hindu political and religious life in the south, a magnet for trade from across the Indian Ocean world, a city of poets and gem markets and singing stone pillars, standing as one of the wealthiest urban centers on the face of the earth. It seemed, to those who walked its streets, permanent. But the very forces that had called it into being, the ring of rival sultanates pressing in from the north, had never truly gone away. They had only been waiting. For generations, the sultanates of the Deccan had fought among themselves nearly as often as they fought Vijayanagara, a fractured, feuding neighborhood of rival Muslim kingdoms that the empire had, time and again, managed to play against one another. But in the middle of the 16th century, that fractured neighborhood did something it had never quite managed before. Several of the major Deccan sultanates set aside their own rivalries and formed a coalition, uniting their combined military strength against the one power that had, for 2 centuries, blocked their expansion southward. In January of 1565, their armies met the forces of Vijayanagara at a place called Talikota, on the banks of the Krishna River. What happened that day has become one of the most studied and most devastating battles in Indian history. Accounts differ on the precise details, but the outcome is not in doubt. The Vijayanagara army, though vast, was decisively broken. The regent, who effectively ruled the empire at the time, was captured on the battlefield and executed on the spot, and, with the command structure shattered and the army in full collapse, the road to the capital itself lay open. In the days and weeks that followed, the victorious Sultanate armies marched on Vijayanagara itself, and what happened next was less a conquest than an obliteration. The city was looted for months. Its temples were stripped of gold and desecrated. Its palaces were burned. The population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands scattered and fled, and the city that Domingo Pais had, compared to Rome, was, within a single year, reduced to a smoking, half-ruined shell. It never recovered. Unlike so many great cities of history, sacked and later rebuilt on the same ground, Vijayanagara was simply abandoned. The surviving remnants of the royal dynasty relocated their capital elsewhere, ruling a shrunken and steadily weakening kingdom for another century before fading from history entirely. The city itself, its palaces, its gem markets, its towering temple gateways, was left to the jungle and the slow, patient work of the monsoon rains. Vines crept over collapsed colonnades. Granite blocks, once fitted with mathematical precision, tumbled and scattered across the boulder-strewn landscape. For nearly 300 years, the city of Victory lay largely forgotten, known mainly to the villagers who lived among its ruins, tending small temples that had, remarkably, never entirely stopped functioning, even as the empire around them crumbled to dust. It was not until the 1800s that the outside world began to properly rediscover what had been lost. British surveyors and antiquarians, most notably Colin Mackenzie, ventured into the ruins, began mapping the site, and slowly pieced together, through inscriptions, temple records, and the surviving foreign travel accounts, just how vast and sophisticated this vanished city had once been. Excavation and restoration work has continued ever since, and today the ruins of Hampi, as the site is now known, stand protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a landscape where soaring temple towers and the impossible stone chariot of the Vitala Temple rise incongruously out of a wilderness of boulders and scrub, still visited by pilgrims and travelers, still only partially excavated after nearly 2 centuries of study. So consider at the last The strange fate of Vijayanagara, a city that a foreign visitor once ranked among the greatest on earth, its markets stacked with diamonds, its temple pillars singing with music, its engineers taming a dry plateau with water carried from miles away, did not fade slowly, the way most empires do, worn down over generations of gradual decline. It was extinguished almost in an instant on a single January afternoon on a riverbank, and never allowed to rise again. What remains is not a living city, but something rarer and stranger, an entire golden age, frozen at the very height of its glory, scattered across 16 square miles of stone, waiting patiently in the grass. If you would like to keep traveling with us through the forgotten corners of the human past, stay a while longer and let the next story begin.